Welcome. In the last few demonstrations, we have seen how to draw stones, essentially, the kind of rounded stones that don't have any sharp edges. So essentially, we saw how to draw these stones lying on the ground, receding into the distance. And what we will do in this demonstration is to show how we can draw a kind of, edge of stones. So this can be used, for example, to depict in a kind of, a river that has, its bank, comprised of these stones. So that's what we will do in this demonstration, to see how we can draw a kind of, receding, edge of stones. And the way we do it is to essentially, start by drawing the stone that is in the front first. So essentially, I draw this stone that is in the front first. And then what I do is to start, adding more stones that are behind by starting from the line of the stone in the front. So always, draw the stones that are in the front the first, and then you essentially define successive layers by starting from the line of the, the stones that are in front. So there we have it. So essentially, this is how, you can draw, for example, 3 stones where this is in front, this is behind the first, and this is behind these two, because essentially the line of the stones starts from here. So this is how you can easily draw the layer of the stones. And what we will also do is essentially also draw a bit more interesting shapes somewhere, something like this. So I draw these stones, and this is behind these 2 stones, because the line for this stone stops here and here. So essentially where the line for a stone stops establishes the relative order of the stones. And I will again go ahead and add one more stone, something like this over here. So this is how you can just vary. They use different shapes and sizes, and you can add in a nice interesting composition for your stone bank. And what I will also do is to essentially add some more stones over here, something like this. And as you can see, what is also happening is that as I'm using this, drawing the stones far out into the distance, I'm making them smaller. So always remember to do that, is that as you draw successive layers of stones far out into the distance, always remember to make them smaller. So this is what I've done over here. So this is how you can easily draw a kind of nice interesting bank of stones. And yeah, essentially then you can use them in a composition in many different ways that we will see in a moment. And what I will do is to draw something similar on the other side as well. So over here I will again start by drawing the stone that is in the front first, and then draw another stone that is behind it. And so essentially I will draw 3 main layers of stones like we did over here, and then I'll go back and essentially draw some other, I'll add some other stones that are behind, but in a more interesting orientation and composition. So something like this. This is how easy it is. So simply just draw the stones in the front and then just add successive layers, and remember to make the successive layers a bit smaller. So there we have it. So now we have nice 2 kind of sides comprising a kind of edge, a stone edge. And what we can do at this point is to we can have some kind of trees in the center, for example, to have a kind of forest scene where we have the stone edges and a view of forest from the middle. Or we can also kind of just draw a line like this, and then depict this kind of a river coming down. So this this, in this case this will become a kind of stone edge for a river that is flowing through. So let's do that in this drawing. So once we have defined this kind of stone edge, the next step is to texture the stones, and we will do this using these parallel lines that we saw in other demonstrations. So essentially for a stone, what we do is we start by laying down the first layer of these parallel lines to define the basic tone for a stone. So this is our initial tone, and then what we do is to essentially add more layers to define that tonal difference. So essentially to bring out the roundness of any object, you need to have the difference in tone on its surface, and for the stone we need to do the same. So what I did is to use this white as our first layer, in the whitest, lightest. Then we have the second layer, and as you add more lines, it becomes darker. Right, so that's what we do with pen and ink. So essentially add more layers of lines to essentially create the tonal difference. And that's what I've done over here. So for example, for this tone we have white, and then we have this lighter tone, this almost middle tone, and this is the darkest tone. So this is the kind of way in which you can create the tonal difference on the surface of a stone. And when you do that, that's when you give it a kind of curvature, that kind of roundness. So essentially just by adding these kind of tonal differences on the surface of a stone, we are able to give it a feeling of roundness. So over here again I add 1 layer of line, and then I'll go back and add a second layer as well. So again, the number of layers or the number of tones that you provide on a stone will depend on your interest. So over here, I have white, 1 tone, 2 tone, and 3 tones. So essentially, there are 4 tones across this biggest stone. But what happens is that as the size of the stone decreases, you don't have that much space to add that many tones. So you start to reduce the number of tones that you would use on its surface to give its curvature. So this stone, has smaller size. So I have white, 1, and 2. So there's only 3 tones, and whereas this stone has 4 tones. So essentially, depending on how much surface you have to work with, you use appropriate number of tones. And at the very end, we will see that for these smallest tones, we just use 2 black and white, right, just to give it the basic tonal difference. So that's what you have to do. So essentially, based on the size that you have to work with, you can give it the appropriate tonal variation. So over here again, for the stones that are a bit bigger, I'm using white, 1 and 2, so 3 tones across their surface. And I'll do something similar over here. So now what I will do is, for example, this tone is much smaller in size, so I'll just use 2 tones over here, just a bit darker over here, and then this darkest. So this is kind of 2 tones, darkest and bit second tone. And I'll do something similar over here as well. Over here, then I'll go back and just add a bit more dark something over here. So now essentially we're just using 2 tones for these stones that are a bit smaller in size. And again I go back and add. And what I will do for these stones that are smallest is to not even add one layer of parallel line. I'll simply go ahead and just add a bit of jagged darkness to the edges, something like this. So over here, this stone I was able to add a parallel line and then darken their end. So this has 2 tones. But for these smaller stones, I won't add parallel line because I don't really have that much space. So I'll just add a bit of jagged darkness, something like this, to essentially just create a kind of 2 tone using the black and the white, something like this. So this is how you have to create a tonal difference, but the amount of tones that you use on the surface will depend on the size. So over here we have 4 tones for this tone. Over here we are using 2 tones, 3 tones for this one. And over here I'm using 2 tones which is dark and middle, and over here I have just dark and white, so something like this. So this is how you can easily create the kind of nice tonal tones on the surface of the stones, and essentially give it a nice feel for their curvature, their volume. So there we have it, right? And then what we will do is essentially to do something similar on the other side as well. So I'll start by laying down the initial layer of line for this stone over here, and I'll come back and add a second layer as well. And then I will further darken this base to essentially add the darkest tone over here. So again we have dark, middle, and even light. So essentially it has around 4 tones. And then I'll go back and again add the same kind of tones to the other stones as well. So over here, so essentially you can also see what feels good. So essentially over here I have this light and dark. So some if you find that this is bringing out the curvature nicely, then you can stop at that. But if you like to play with the darker tone, then you can add a bit of darker tone as well, like I did over here. So essentially this also depends on your interest, right? So some people like a bit of deep blacks in their drawings. Some people, they like to leave the tones a bit lighter. So depending on what you prefer, you can either kind of use the dark blacks, or you can just leave it a bit light. So for example here I can go back and simply add one more layer over here, something like this. So there we have it. And then what I will do for these other stones is to do something similar over here. So what I'm doing is to simply use black and white, like we saw for these stones. So again these are very small stones. So what I'll do is just add a bit of jagged darkness, and it's important to keep them jagged. That's what kind of gives a nice feel for jaggedness of the stones, right? So I'll go ahead and just simply add a bit of jaggedness over here, something like this. So there we have it, right? So essentially this is how you can easily create a kind of stone bank, and essentially use these kind of parallel lines to give a different tone. And as the size decreases, just use black and white to essentially give it some variation at least. And what we will do next is to come back and essentially kind of add a bit of tick marks. So essentially you just add a bit of tick marks like this. And again, never use a kind of flat shape. So don't use a flat shape like this, but kind of tapered shape, something like this. So again if you want to add a crevice, use a line like this and then add a bit of darkness at the center. And always remember to make the edges tapered. So you want to add a this kind of taper darkness to indicate the crevices and things like that. So that's what I'm doing. I'm simply adding a bit of line and then just darkening surface to add a bit of crevices and things like that over here for these stones. So I'll go ahead and again add a bit of crevices and something like this. So this also brings out more a feel for the stones. So there we have it, something like this. And if you want, you can also make the edges a bit jagged. So in other tutorials we saw, so for example if this is the outline of the stone, you can just add a bit of tapered dark to the edges to create a feeling of kind of rough edges. So that also adds to the interest. So I'll just go ahead and, for example, I just added a bit of this tapered black over here, and that creates a kind of imperfection on the surface, and that also adds to the interest. So I can add that as well over here, a bit over here, a bit over here. And even for these stones, you can just go add a bit of taperedness over there just to kind of create some kind of imperfection on the surface, something like this. So as you can see, this always adds to the interest. In a sense, it gives a feel for kind of roughness on the surface of the stone, and makes them more believable. So there we have it, right? So something like this. At this point, you can always add a bit of deep black. So for example, what I did was to kind of add a bit of deep black over here in this area, and that always adds interest. So essentially, you do not want kind of a kind of uniform tone in your depiction of stone. So sometimes the stone will have a deep crevice, right? So adding a bit of deep black over here, something like I did over here, this kind of adds more visual interest. So something like this, you can always try to play around with and kind of add and have more visual interest in your composition. So that's the great thing with the pen and ink, is that you only have like especially with black and white drawings, you only have black and white tones to work with, right? So you want to add more interest, and the way you do it is to be able to add this kind of deep black to essentially kind of indicate a kind of deep crevice and adds more interest. So there we have it. So something like this. And then what I will do is to again add these crevices on this other side as well. So again what I'm doing is to add this tapered crevices, and again I'm not overdoing it. So you always have to avoid overdoing these crevices and marks in your drawing. So essentially when you start adding, you will see that they're starting to get a nice feel for a bit of roughness and things like that, and that's when you can stop. So over here now I feel that there are enough marks to give it a nice feel for roughness on its surface, but I don't really want to go ahead and keep adding dots and things like that, because that kind of sometimes it doesn't really add to the interest, and it changes the overall tone and makes them a bit darker than than what is interesting. So that's why always just play around with it, just add a bit over here, a bit over there, and when you feel that that the feeling is coming out, then then stop at that point. So and that's what I'm doing essentially, is to add a bit over here for the stones. And just a small dot or small tick is enough to kind of give it a feel for roughness sometimes, right? So it's a suggestion that matters, right? So in pen and ink, we essentially want to play with the suggestion. So over here, just by adding a bit of taper, now we're having a nice feel for the roughness of the surface of the stone, and that's enough, right? So I'll just stop over here, and then simply I will add a bit of surface imperfection to other stones if need be. And there we have it. And then for this stone I will add a bit of marks and ticks. So there we have it. So now this is looking like a nice kind of bank of stones. And what we can do at this point is essentially draw our river, right? So this is how essentially you just by start by laying down your stone in the front, and then draw the successive layers of stone behind, and then add these kind of more interesting shapes, and remember to keep them small. So this is how you can easily draw a bank of stone. And what we will do essentially is to indicate kind of river flowing through it, right? So what I will do is to essentially draw these lines to indicate kind of waterfall. So essentially we have this kind of waterfall over here. So this line they indicate a waterfall, and then I will just simply use a bit of dot, something like this, to indicate kind of water over here. And what we need to do next is to essentially indicate the reflection of this bank of stone over here to bring out the feel for water. So to draw the water, what we do is to use a mark like this, a line like this. So we have seen this in the other demonstrations, that this line is very good at depicting a kind of movement in the water. So what I will do is to start by adding this line, and essentially what we do is to just keep adding these lines more and more to essentially bring out the reflection of this stone wall as well. So what I will do over here is to just keep adding more and more, but always just remember to keep it random. So do not place them in any particular order. Just keep adding, keep moving your hand, and what you will see is that that as you add more lines, it will start to get darker, and that will then start to indicate a kind of reflection of this stone wall. So as you can see over here, now this is becoming darker, and this is actually requiring a kind of feel for the reflection of that stone wall. And I will do the same for the other edge, other bank as well. And it's important to keep the center light, because that is where the reflection is not there. So reflection is most believable, but when it depicts or when it mimics the kind of structure that whose reflection it is. So essentially we have the stone wall, but in the center we want to have a kind of lighter area that is depicting the kind of water without the reflection. And the other thing you also do is to make the reflection lighter as it goes out from the source. So again, we covered this in detail in the tutorials, but so essentially, your reflection has to be the darkest, where it meets the stone. So that what I will do is to essentially add more lines over here, right? So now our reflection is the darkest over here, and then as it goes out, it's decreasing in its intensity. So that is giving it a more believable aspect. And I will do the same over here as well. So over here, I'll just add more lines. So again, bring out its darkness, which will give it more intensity, and then I will add less lines in the distance to essentially make it lighter. So essentially you need to have that kind of variation in your reflection. So darkest where it meets the stone, and then it's reducing in intensity as it goes out, and then just add a bit more lines furthest out just to indicate water without the reflection. So that adds an overall element of interest. So there we have it, right? So now this is how you can easily draw kind of stone wall and indicate kind of water, a small waterfall, and yeah, draw the reflection of the stone wall, and have a nice simple drawing of a river flowing through a bank of stones, a small waterfall as well, in under yeah, 15 minutes. So this is a great simple drawing, and essentially, like I said before, you can use this stone wall in many different ways, right? So you can have this can be a part of a river scene like we did, or it can be a part of a forest scene, or you can even have a kind of house over here, right? So there are a lot of different possibilities, but yeah, essentially the concept or the main technique for drawing a stone wall is very simple. Essentially always draw the stone in the front, and then draw the main layer of the big stones behind it, and then once you have this main layer of stones, then you essentially add other stones that are even behind these three main layers, and make them successive smaller, something like this. So this is kind of an easy way to essentially add a stone wall, and then you shade it the way we discussed, which is to use these parallel lines and create a tonal difference across the surface of the main stone. And then for the smaller stones, just even use a kind of jagged darkness to essentially just create two tones, black and white, just to give it a nice feel, a nice feel for their curvature. And then at the end, always use these tapered marks, just to add some to their surface and to the body of the stones to bring out their roughness. And this is how you can easily draw a stone bank, stone edge, and yeah, essentially create a nice simple drawing in under 15 minutes. Thanks, take care, bye bye.